Okay.
All right, thank you. So good to see everybody again. This is a very nice service. Thank you. So tonight's session is about racial justice and immigrant rights and Jews' involvement in those movements. The main focus will be on Jews in the civil rights movement. But if we have time, we'll also talk a little bit about some Jews who were prominent in advocating for immigrant rights. And they are related, of course. So, this is a very appropriate time to be talking about Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. First of all, this is a very iconic photograph, which I'm sure you've seen, of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King, and other civil rights leaders in the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. And this is a photograph that is well known in American Jewish history. And we'll be talking a little bit, we'll be talking about Rabbi Heschel's role a little bit later this evening. But this is an appropriate time to be talking about Jews' involvement in the civil rights movement. And you know that Jews played a very important and prominent role in the civil rights movement from the really beginning in the 19th century, but certainly in the 20th century, and really throughout the 20th century, not only in the 1950s and 1960s. And as we've mentioned before, not all Jews supported the involvement in the civil rights movement, but Jews were disproportionately involved as lawyers, as activists, and as philanthropists, and in many other ways. So it's in a very appropriate time to be talking about this subject because this is, of course, February is Black History Month. And in addition to which, this year has been a very difficult year in the United States, aside from the pandemic, which we talked about during the first session. This has, of course, been a year of racial reckoning in the United States with the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, and others. And there's been a great deal of discussion about systemic racism in this country. And of course, President Biden is placing great emphasis on racial justice. He issued a statement on racial equity on January 26th with an accompanying series of executive actions. And we've been thinking a lot about this issue also since the election, especially with the special election in Georgia, where we had the first Black senator and the first Jewish senator from Georgia. Quite a historic occurrence. So Reverend Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff, and they actually, as you see, often campaign together. And during the campaign, it was often brought up that Jews and Blacks have worked together side by side to promote rights for African Americans in the United States. So Warnock put out a video ad that was produced by the Jewish Democratic Council of America before the January 5th election. And in the video, he highlighted the Jewish-Black Alliance, the involvement of Abraham Joshua Heschel, the many Jews who went down south to work on behalf of Black rights, and especially, of course, the murder of the three voting rights activists in 1964, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, which is a well-known event during the civil rights movement, and two of the three were Jewish. Here is a very lovely picture of Jon Ossoff during his swearing-in ceremony. And this is a very touching story. I don't know if you saw it at the time, but Jon Ossoff used the Chumash of Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, who was the rabbi of the temple in Atlanta that was bombed in 1958, and was bombed because of Rabbi Rothschild's civil rights activism. So Jon Ossoff, who had his bar mitzvah at the temple, decided to use that Chumash for his swearing-in ceremony. And some of you may have seen the article in the foreword by Janice Rothschild Blumberg, Rabbi Rothschild's wife, who wrote an article about John Asaf using this chumash that was apparently very well worn by her. Her husband had used it all the time, and she and her husband were both very close to Reverend Martin Luther King and his wife, Coretta Scott King. And she said it was extremely meaningful to her that John Asaf decided to use that chumash for his swearing-in ceremony. So all of this is to say that this is an important time to be talking about Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, in the movement for racial justice in this country. And so what we're going to do this evening is talk, as we have done in all of the sessions, talk about some of the individuals. And there are many, many people we could talk about because Jews played such an important role. But we are going to focus on a few individuals at different points in the history. So I'm starting in the mid-19th century with a figure who may not be as well known to many of you. This is Rabbi David Einhorn. And he, as you can see, he looks pretty intense. He was a very activist person, both in terms of religious life and in political life. He definitely believed in speaking out from the pulpit on political issues, which sometimes got him into some difficulties. But he was a very principled person. And he was born in Bavaria and had some difficulty in the Germanic states. He had a number of different rabbinic positions, but he took a very strong stand on reform, which was developing in the Germanic states at that time in the mid-19th century. He advocated for some pretty, pretty strong reforms, pretty extreme, at least for Europe of the time. And he also spoke out on political issues, and that was not particularly popular in the post-1848 revolution, when there was a kind of a counter revolution and a clamping down on anybody with any revolutionary ideas. So Rabbi Einhorn left Europe and he came to the United States in 1855, where he very quickly became involved in all of the religious and political turmoil here in this country. He became the rabbi of Har Sinai congregation in Baltimore, and he immediately became active in the discussions about religious reform here in America. And he differed from Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who was the person best known as the architect of American reform, because Isaac Mayer Wise was more moderate, and he really was hoping to unite all American Jews behind a kind of moderate reform movement. But Rabbi Einhorn was more extreme in his reform efforts. And so he and Isaac Mayer Wise often differed in their approaches. But in addition, as I said, Rabbi Einhorn became involved in political issues. And here he found himself in Baltimore in 1861. And Maryland, as you know, was a slave state in the sense that people owned slaves, but it was also a border state. So it did not become part of the Confederacy, but there were many Southern sympathizers and many pro-slavery sympathizers in Maryland, and a lot of ferment over the slavery issue. So Rabbi Einhorn was very outspoken on abolitionism, and he wrote about abolitionism in his publication Sinai, and gave many very strong sermons promoting the abolitionist cause. And as you can imagine, that was a very difficult thing to be doing at that point. So he was actually forced to leave Baltimore because there were threats against him by a pro-slavery mob. And he had to leave, and he came to Philadelphia. So he became the rabbi of Knesset Israel here in Philadelphia, and later went to New York. As I mentioned, he was a proponent of radical reform. He had some very progressive ideas about women's equality in Judaism, and his prayer book Olat Tamid is still referred to because of its pioneering role in the American reform movement. He took a very strong stand against slavery, especially after Rabbi Morris Rafal, who was a rabbi in New York, had given a sermon about the slavery issue. The sermon was on January 4th, 1861. And Rabbi Rafal really said that the Southerners he did not condone the way Southerners treated their slaves, but Rabbi Rafal in his sermon defended slavery because because of its basis in the Bible. He said that it was legitimate because there was slavery in biblical times. Of course, many Christian ministers had said the same thing, but Rabbi Rafal's sermon got a lot of press because people said, oh, this is a learned rabbi who is saying this, and they felt that it gave even more legitimacy to the pro-slavery position. But as you can imagine, on slavery, as on many other issues, there was a lot of friction within the Jewish community and differences of opinion. And a number of Jewish spokespeople came out very strongly against Rabbi Rafal's sermon, including Rabbi Einhorn. And here is Rabbi Einhorn's, part of Rabbi Einhorn's response to Rabbi Rafal. He said, a religion which exhorts to spare the mother from the bird's nest. This is a reference to the biblical injunction that one should not, if one is going to take the eggs or the chicks, one should chase the mother bird away first. I had the citation here, it's Deuteronomy. I'm sure the Rabbi Pearlstein can tell us, but I'll find it. But in any case, and many people interpret this as a sign of compassion to the mother bird. And so Rabbi Einhorn is referring to this biblical verse, and he's saying, cannot consent to the heart-rending spectacle of robbing a human mother of her child. Thus crumbles into 1,000 fragments the rickety structure of Dr. Rafal. To proclaim in the name of Judaism that God has consecrated the institution of slavery, such a shame and reproach the Jewish religious press is duty-bound to disown and to disavow, if both are not to be stigmatized forever. Why should we keep silence when a Jewish preacher plays such pranks? A Jew, the offspring of a race which daily praises God for deliverance from the bondage of Egypt, undertakes to parade slavery as a perfectly sinless institution sanctioned by God. A more extraordinary phenomenon could hardly be imagined. So, Rabbi Einhorn recognized, of course, he acknowledged that there was slavery in biblical times, but he also said that there's development in Judaism and that eventually Judaism evolved and developed to a point where slavery is something that could no longer be countenanced. Here's another piece from his publication, Sinai, which I think is I have found it to be particularly poignant in view of the events of the last year in this country. He wrote, does the Negro have less ability to think, to feel, to will? Does he have less of a desire to happiness? Was he born not to be entitled to all these? Does the Negro have an iron neck that does not feel a burdensome yoke? Does he have a stiffer heart that does not bleed when his beloved child is torn away from him? So you can get a sense of the power of Rabbi Einhorn's words and his arguments. He was an early pioneer and spokesperson for abolitionism, which at the time, there were Jewish abolitionists, but I think I mentioned last week when we talked about Ernestine Rose, who also spoke out very strongly against slavery in the mid-19th century. I had mentioned that there were a number of Jews who had anti-slavery views, but they often did not join abolitionist societies because those societies had a Christian evangelical tone to them. And there were some leading abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who often used anti-Semitic rhetoric against their political opponents. And so many Jews who had anti-slavery views did not feel comfortable joining abolitionist societies, but they did speak out against slavery in other ways. And again, as I mentioned, Jews had a variety of opinions on slavery. Some lived in the South and they were part of the whole slaveholding system. It was a very small number, relatively speaking, of Jews who lived in the South. Most Jews lived in the North. But there were Jews who supported slavery because they were part of that culture. There were Jews who were very opposed to slavery and spoke out against it. And then there were many Jews who were sort of in the middle, who were afraid to speak out on slavery because it was a very controversial issue. And they didn't want to stand out when Jews were relatively new to the country, and didn't want to take a position on a controversial issue. So as happened later in the later civil rights movement, Jews were prominent in the civil rights movement, but there were some Jews who didn't take a position on the civil rights movement. And there were some Jews who were indifferent or apathetic as well. So there were always Jews on all points, but at least when in terms of the civil rights movement, Jews do play a disproportionate role later in the 20th century. So we're going to move on to talk about Rabbi Heschel in a moment, but I just want to say something about, actually, I'm going to skip ahead for just a moment, just a little bit, and we'll go back. Oops. You're getting a little bit of a preview of the rest of the session. But Lillian Wald, who we talked a great deal about in the first session, played a very important role in early 20th century, the early 20th century beginning of the civil rights movement. So there were many Jews who joined her in supporting the establishment of the NAACP in 1909. And actually, Lillian Wald provided the venue for the creation of the NAACP, which was first called the National Negro Conference, and that was held at the Henry Street Settlement. So Lillian Wald kind of started the ball rolling. There were a number of other Jewish leaders who were involved in the founding and work of the NAACP, along with Blacks at the time, and also a number of other white people who were not Jewish. But there were quite a few Jews who were involved in the beginnings of the NAACP: Lewis Marshall, Herbert Lehman, Jacob Schiff, Felix Frankfurter, etc. And there were Jews who were in the leadership of the NAACP: Arthur and Joel Spingarn, who were brothers. Arthur was the head of the NAACP Legal Committee, and Joel was the chairman of the board of directors and the president of the NAACP for from 1966 to 1975. So there were Jews who were involved in the founding of the NAACP in the early 20th century, and Jews who continued to be in the leadership of that organization, which was an early civil rights organization and still exists, of course. So Jews were involved in a variety of ways in the early civil rights movement of the early 20th century. Lillian Wald took an active role in the work of the NAACP. She helped to promote. She tried to get that organization to work on behalf of healthcare in the South, and also on behalf of trying to get more women, in particular Black women, to become involved in to study and prepare themselves for healthcare positions, nursing, etc., in the South. And Lillian Wald was also involved in a variety of other ways in trying to provide equal health care for the Black community. So the National Organization of Public Health Nursing that she founded had African American as well as white members, and it also supported the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses that had been founded in 1908. Lillian Wald also established a parallel settlement house to the Henry Street Settlement called Stillman House, which served an African American neighborhood in New York. And she became an expert on conditions of the Black community in New York, and frequently addressed meetings dealing with race relations. Interestingly, in 1908, she was asked to intervene in a case of police brutality against a Black child. And she contacted the police commissioner and worked on that particular case. So that's an example of the kind of work that she did in the early 20th century. And of course, there were many other people who became involved in a whole variety of ways Jews who were trying to improve conditions for blacks in the very early 20th century. One who is very famous is Julius Rosenwald, the head of Sears Company, who you may know was a very important philanthropist. And among the causes that he supported were the establishment of institutions for educational institutions for Black children from an early, at all levels, including at the higher education levels. And also recreational facilities and healthcare facilities. So there were many Jews who were involved in trying to improve life for the African American community in the early 20th century. But I'm going to skip back. Sorry. To talk about what's a little bit better known to us, which is the civil rights movement in the mid 20th century. Even in the 1950s, there began to be some very prominent Jews who worked with Blacks to try to promote civil rights. So, for example, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which was founded in 1950, and in the leadership at that time was A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, and Arnold Aronson. Arnold Aronson was on the staff of the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council, but he was also very prominent in the Leadership Conference. And the Leadership Conference over the next 30 years was a very important civil rights organization that helped to promote, lobby for the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1957, 1960, and 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They also played a role in the organizing of the 1963 March on Washington. So this is, really beginning in 1950 and over a period of a number of decades. And many people have done research on some of the Jewish lawyers who were involved in promoting civil rights within the legal realm. But here were organizations that advocated on behalf of the very important civil rights legislation of the 1960s. In addition, there are many developments that we could cite, many aspects of the civil rights movement in which Jews played a key role. But the American Jewish Congress Commission on Law and Social Action also worked closely with the NAACP during the 1940s and 1950s. Rabbi Israel Goldstein, who was its president, said in 1956, "We must defend the rights of the Negro as zealously as we would defend our rights as Jews, whenever and wherever these may be threatened." We know, of course, that in the 1961, the summer of 1961, the Freedom Riders who went down south to challenge racial discrimination in public accommodations, and they were called Freedom Riders because they rode on buses throughout the South to challenge segregation on buses and in bus stations, that Jews were a high proportion, disproportionately involved in the Freedom Rider movement. There are different figures that you'll see in various accounts, but one is that Jews were 2/3 of the white Freedom Riders. Another figure that I've seen is 1/3 to 1/2 of all Freedom Riders. And Jews were very prominent, again, Jewish students especially were very prominent during Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, where there, again, one figure is between 1/3 and 1/2 of the young white volunteers who went south during the Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, which was an effort, as you know, to register Blacks to vote. And Jews were again very prominently represented. And that was the time when the 3 young civil rights workers were killed by the KKK when they went to investigate the bombing of a Black church. So that, of course, was something that was very much in the news at the time. And it illustrated the very strong Jewish involvement in the mid-1960s civil rights movement in the South. Many women young Jewish women went down south at that point, and there's some very interesting research on that aspect of the movement by Deborah Schultz, who wrote They Went South, and a book about Jewish women in particular who were involved in the civil rights efforts in the South in the 1960s. It's important to point out, and we'll talk about Rabbi Heschel in just a moment, but it's important to point out that, of course, the Jews who lived in the South had different opinions. Jews constituted about 1% of the Southern population in this period, in mid 20th century. And some Jews in the South were very outspoken on behalf of civil rights, in particular, a number of rabbis, Rabbi Perry Nussbaum of Jackson, Mississippi, Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, who I mentioned before, from Atlanta, Rabbi Emmett Frank from Arlington, Virginia, and Rabbi Charles Mantenband of Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. He moved to different congregations. I actually, when I did some research at the American Jewish Archives last year, I actually had an opportunity to read through some of Rabbi Nussbaum's reports of the events of that time, and it was actually very riveting reading. But there were rabbis who spoke out on behalf of civil rights. Very often there were repercussions against them, as we mentioned, the bombing of the temple in Atlanta, and Rabbi Nussbaum's home and synagogue were bombed in 1967. That's what I was reading about in his papers. And this was, unfortunately, there were reprisals against rabbis who spoke out. And Jonathan Sarna, historian Jonathan Sarna, has said that some 10% of the terrorist bombings in the South between 1954 and 1959 were against Jewish targets. That could be synagogues, rabbis' homes, Jewish community centers. So understandably, there was also a lot of fear among Jews in the South about speaking out on behalf of civil rights, and about Northerners who came down south to speak out on and to work with civil rights activists in the South, because the Southern Jews did feel very much under threat. And again, so here's an example of differences of opinion within the Jewish community based on, in many cases, on fears for their personal safety. So I'm going to focus a little bit on Rabbi Heschel, who was, of course, one of the most prominent figures in the of Jews who were involved in the civil rights movement. We talked a little bit about Rabbi Heschel at the beginning and his biography, so I won't dwell on that. But we're going to talk mostly about his involvement specifically in the civil rights movement. As you know, he was very involved in all sorts of social activism, including the anti-Vietnam War movement. But he's particularly well known for his involvement in civil rights. And the beginning of his daughter Susanna Heschel said that his involvement in social activism began in the 1960s, in part because he was involved in translating his book on the prophets that was originally written as his doctoral dissertation when he was in Germany. He was translating that into English in the 1960s. And we talked about his book on the prophets and the interview in which he discusses his feelings about the prophets and how inspiring they were for him in our first session. But apparently, as he was working on this translation, he was re-inspired to become more involved in social activism as a result, because that was what the prophets did. And he felt that in the tradition of the prophets, one should realize one's religious ideals through political action. So his initial involvement in the civil rights movement was when he spoke at the National Conference on Religion and Race in Chicago on January 14th, 1963. And that was when he met Reverend Martin Luther King, with whom he had a very close association for a number of years. This is his speech. I gave you excerpts. It's a very long speech, and I excerpted it, but even the excerpt is long. But I think it is worth reading in full, even this lengthy excerpt, because, as you know, Rabbi Heschel spoke very, very powerfully. And here he is speaking out against racism, but very much from his own perspective, from within a Jewish perspective. And this is what he said. At the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast to me." While Pharaoh retorted, "Who is the Lord that I should heed this voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. Let us dodge no issues. Let us yield no inch to bigotry. Few of us seem to realize how insidious, how radical, how universal and evil racism is. Few of us realize that racism is man's gravest threat to man. To think of man in terms of white, black, or yellow is more than an error. It is an eye disease, a cancer of the soul. The redeeming quality of man lies in his ability to sense his kinship with all men. Yet there is a deadly poison that inflames the eye, making us see the generality of race, but not the uniqueness of the human face. There are people in our country whose moral sensitivity suffers a blackout when confronted with the Black man's predicament. How many disasters do we have to go through in order to realize that all of humanity has a stake in the liberty of one person? Whenever one person is offended, we are all hurt. What begins as inequality of some inevitably ends as inequality of all. In referring to the Negro in this paper, we must, of course, always keep equally in mind the plight of all individuals belonging to a racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural minority. 100 years ago, the emancipation was proclaimed. It is time for the white man to strive for self-emancipation, to set himself free of bigotry. Let us cease to be apologetic, cautious, timid. By negligence and silence, we have all become accessory before the God of mercy to the injustice committed against the Negroes by men of our nation. Our derelictions are many. We have failed to demand, to insist, to challenge, to chastise. An honest estimation of the moral state of our society will disclose some are guilty, but all are responsible. What we need is a total mobilization of heart, intelligence, and wealth for the purpose of love and justice. God is in search of man, waiting, hoping for man to do his will. This world, this society can be redeemed. What we need is the involvement of every one of us as individuals. Very powerful words by Rabbi Heschel. Of course, as you know, Rabbi Heschel is best known for joining Martin Luther King, Ralph Bunche, and Ralph Abernathy, and other religious leaders on the famous Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery. And we saw the picture earlier this evening in 1965. And there's been a lot written about the march and about his involvement in the march. His daughter, Susanna Heschel, said, has written about it and what it was like for her and her mother to send him off to something that they knew could possibly be dangerous, but that he felt was critically important. And she said that before the march, there was a service in the chapel. Rabbi Heschel read Psalm 27, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" And Reverend Martin Luther King gave a sermon. Afterwards, Rabbi Heschel wrote to Reverend Martin Luther King and said, "The day we marched together out of Selma was a day of sanctification. That day, I hope, will never be passed to me." And he talked about the sermon that Reverend Martin Luther King had given, and how inspiring that was to him. Susanna Heschel also said that her father said after, and this is a very famous quote of his, that after the march, he said, "I thought of my having walked with Hasidic rabbis on various occasions. I felt a sense of the holy in what I was doing. I felt my legs were praying." The very famous quote by Rabbi Heschel. Susanna Heschel, in an article in Hadassah magazine of June of 1985, called Heschel and Selma, said the following about her father and Dr. King. She said, "Like Dr. King, my father drew upon religious motifs to make political points. For both, religion and politics meshed, and involvement in social causes had a spiritual quality. They put political debates into a transcendent focus, teaching that we should not ask what kind of society we want to create, but what kind of society God wants us to create." And she also said that her father would often say, "To be a Jew is not simply to be, but to stand for." So I'm going to go on to talk about another famous figure, maybe not quite as famous as Rabbi Heschel, but a person who should be known to a lot of us because of his important involvement. Just a moment. And that's Rabbi Joachim Prinz. There is a biography of Rabbi Prinz, and there is a documentary that just came out. So it's actually his autobiography that was edited by historian Michael Meyer. But there's also a documentary about Rabbi Prinz, which you might be able to get hold of, which I've seen. It's very powerful, called Joachim Prinz, I Shall Not Be Silent. So he has a very, very compelling biography. He was born in Germany in a small village. The family then moved to the city of Oppeln, and he joined the Blau-Weiß youth movement, the Zionist youth movement, where he got some of his early training, I guess, in activism. He quite an amazing figure. He got a PhD in philosophy and was ordained by the Breslau Jewish Theological Seminary, which was a middle of the road but kind of liberal rabbinical seminary in Germany. And at a very young age, in 1926, at age 24, he became the rabbi of the Peace Synagogue in Berlin and was a very, very popular speaker, eventually becoming the rabbi of the Berlin Jewish community, of the entire community. Wrote many books and was involved in a number of cultural and educational institutions. So he was a rabbi in Berlin for 11 years, but he was also very outspoken, like Rabbi Einhorn. And he was a Zionist and denounced when the Nazis came to power, and even before they came to power, he spoke out against the Nazis. And of course, that put him in danger. So after a number of harassment, quite a bit of harassment and arrests by the Gestapo, in 1937, he was arrested by the Gestapo and expelled from Germany. So that was, it was a difficult period for him, but fortunate for him because he was able to get out of the country and came to the United States, where originally he was asked by Rabbi Stephen Wise to go around the country and speak on behalf of the United Palestine Appeal, and basically to let the American Jewish community know what was going on in Germany. So this was a very important role that he took on. But in 1939, he became rabbi of Temple B'nai Abraham in Newark, New Jersey, and remained there for 38 years. He was a great speaker. He was known to get about 1,000 people attending an average Friday night, which was quite something. There was also a wonderful cantor there for those of us who were interested in synagogue history. Cantor Abraham Shapiro, who had an operatic voice. So the synagogue grew in membership and did very well with the two of them there. Rabbi Prince was very involved in Jewish communal life. He was the president of Jewish Educational Association of Essex County. He was a leader in the World Jewish Congress, the chairman of the governing council of the World Jewish Congress. He was the president of the American Jewish Congress from 1958 to 1966. He was a director of the Conference of Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, which had been established in 1951 to try to negotiate to get payments to individual survivors and to return or to restore Jewish property that had been confiscated during the Holocaust. So he was involved in a whole variety of things. He was a chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, a longtime Zionist. So that gives you an idea of his activity. But as president of the American Jewish Congress, he represented the American Jewish community as an organizer of the August 28, 1963 March on Washington. And he had already begun to be involved in the civil rights movement earlier because Newark, of course, had a large minority population, and he had been involved in various demonstrations and sit-ins against segregation before this point. But as president of the American Jewish Congress, he played a key role as a leader in organizing the March on Washington. And because he had such an important leadership role, he was asked to speak at the march, which was attended by about 250,000 people. And we know that there were, according to some accounts, more than 200 rabbis participated of all denominations. And his speech, which is not as well known as Reverend Martin Luther King's speech, but should be, was given immediately before Reverend King's speech. And it was called "The Issue is Silence." So here is the speech. It was relatively short, and you can Google Rabbi Prince, and you'll be able to hear the speech as he gave it. It's actually very powerful to hear him to hear him give the speech. But I'm going to at least you can see the words here. I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the sham and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which make a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to this great demonstration, in which thousands of us proudly participate, a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. From our Jewish historic experience, we say, our ancient history began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. During the Middle Ages, my people lived for 1,000 years in the ghettos of Europe. Our modern history begins with the proclamation of emancipation. He means the French Revolution. It is for these reasons that it is not merely sympathy and compassion for the Black people of America that motivates us. It is a sense of complete identification and solidarity born of our own painful historical experience. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. Not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. Okay. I have, there are plenty of photos of Jews' involvement in the in the civil rights movement. But I chose this one because there is, as I mentioned, Deborah Schultz has done quite a bit of work on Jewish women who went down south and worked on behalf of the civil rights movement, women who were inspired to do so for a variety of reasons. And she interviewed many of the people who did it. And some of them said that they grew up, like Rabbi Prince, they grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust. In his case, he actually experienced this in Germany. But in some of these other women's cases, they grew up in refugee communities, in communities where their parents had been survivors, and many of the people they associated with were survivors. And many of them felt that that is what impelled them to become involved in the civil rights movement. But of course, people became involved for a whole variety of reasons. One of the women who was very active was, I don't have a picture of her, but Jacqueline Levine, who lived in Newark. She was a Newark housewife, and she was inspired by Rabbi Prince to become involved. And she and her 5-year-old daughter participated in protests remember the well-known protest that started the civil rights movement to desegregate lunch counters at Woolworth. And so she was involved in some of those early protests. And she said her Rabbi Prince, inspired her to do this. And she went to the 1963 March on Washington. She later went to the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. And she later became president of the Women's Division of the American Jewish Congress and vice president of the Council of Jewish Federations and Welfare Funds. She later became a very key activist for the Jewish feminist movement, for Jewish women's equality in Jewish communal organizations. So it is very interesting to see the trajectory of her Jewish communal involvement. But again, here she was inspired by Rabbi Prince. Okay. I wanted to just mention Rabbi Saul Berman, who is a professor of Jewish studies at Yeshiva University Stern College for Women, and played an important role in the civil rights movement as well. And I thought it was particularly timely to mention Rabbi Berman because he had gone down for the Selma to Montgomery March, but he went a little bit early, and he was there for Purim. And he was involved in peaceful protests, but the peaceful protesters were arrested and they found themselves in prison for Purim. And there are many accounts of this story in March of 1965. But he said while he was in Purim, he had brought his Megillah with him, but it was in the house where he was staying. And so somebody came and brought the Megillah to him, including some kosher food that he had brought. And he chanted the Megillah, and one of the other rabbis who was arrested also translated the Megillah for all the people who were in prison. And a group led by an Episcopal priest from Massachusetts wrote a statement of common concern that they called the Purim of Selma, 5725. So this was a very unusual Purim, but Rabbi Berman felt that it was important to, to obviously to bring the tradition of the reading of the Megillah to that experience. And then he talked about how later on the Friday, there was another protest, and once again they were arrested. The rabbis had a Shabbat evening service in prison, and they were released the next morning. But because it was Shabbat, Rabbi Berman said he wouldn't ride on the buses to the march. So 300 people, some people say 250 people, decided to walk with him from the prison to the place where the march was going to start. That was an important show of solidarity. So recently, actually in June of 2020, Rabbi Berman spoke about his experience, and he talked about the importance of Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. from the point of view of Jewish tradition. And in that talk, this was, as I said, in June of 2020, he talked about the importance in our tradition of tochacha, or rebuke, which in his view, and I would imagine other people would say the same thing, means that we are obligated as Jews to morally improve both Jewish and non-Jewish society. So he teaches a great deal about Jewish law, and felt that he was acting in the spirit of Jewish law in his work on behalf of the civil rights movement. So I'm going to open this up shortly, but I did want to just share with you a little bit on a related topic about immigrant rights, because that's also a very, very big issue today. And I just wanted to share a little bit of a kind of, it was a letter, a legal brief that was written by Lewis Marshall, very well-known Jewish, well-known lawyer, communal leader, very involved in all the affairs of the Jewish community, longtime president of the American Jewish Committee, and involved in so many different cases. He was involved in the issue of when Henry Ford published all of this anti-Semitic material in his newspaper. Lewis Marshall was the person who demanded a public apology. He was also involved in the legal defense of Leo Frank, who was lynched in the Atlanta area in 1915. And he was a very, very important communal leader. But one of the things that he did was to become involved in the struggle against immigration restriction, which grew stronger in the 1920s. And I did want to share with you a piece of the letter that he wrote to President Calvin Coolidge in 1924, opposing immigration restriction, which had been growing stronger in the 1920s. And he did this because he was the son of German Jewish immigrants, and he knew something about the immigrant experience himself, and felt that immigrants should have the right to come to America and to settle here, and that there should not be restrictions based on ethnic origin, which was what was happening in the 1921 and 1924 Immigration Acts. Here's a little bit about what we just talked about, and this is his letter. I'm going to excerpt it just in the interest of time. He said, well, the present bill is avowedly discriminatory. This is the first time in the history of American legislation that there has been an attempt to discriminate in respect to European immigration between those who come from different parts of the continent. It is not only a differentiation as to countries of origin, but also of racial stocks and of religious beliefs. Those coming from Northern and Western Europe are supposed to be Anglo-Saxon or mythical Nordics, and to a large extent Protestant. Those coming from Southern and Eastern Europe are of different racial stocks and of a different faith. There are today in this country millions of citizens, both native born and naturalized, descended from those racial stocks and entertaining those religious beliefs against which this bill deliberately discriminates. To add insult to injury, the effort has been made to justify this class legislation by charging that those who are sought to be excluded are inferior types and not assimilable. There is no justification in fact for such a contention. In common with all other immigrants, those who have come from the country sought to be tabooed have been industrious and law-abiding and have made valuable contributions to our industrial, commercial, and social development. And then I'm going down to the last paragraph. What we regard as the danger lurking in this legislation is that it stimulates racial, national, and religious hatreds and jealousies, that it encourages one part of our population to arrogate to itself a sense of superiority and to classify another as one of inferiority. I also wanted to share with you a quote from Lillian Wald, who also opposed the immigration restriction of the same time. And it was another cause that she was involved in. In fact, she and Lewis Marshall were actually on a commission on immigration together. Lewis Marshall chaired the commission and Lillian Wald was on the commission in New York State. And she said something similar in her opposition to immigration restriction, where she talked about the fact that when she addressed a committee of the House on the proposed legislation, she said at the bottom of this slide, "I protested against a departure from our tradition, and that is the tradition of welcoming immigrants, and reminded the members of the committee of the splendid Americans who would have been lost to this country had the door been so closed upon them. The immigrant brings in a steady stream of new life and new blood to the nation. The unskilled have made possible the construction of great engineering works, have helped to build bridges and roadways. The number of skilled artisans and craftsmen among immigrants and the contribution they make to the cultural side of our national life are too rarely emphasized." Then Lillian Wald has another great quote about what should happen with immigrants when they come here, because she worked with many immigrants in her work with the Henry Street settlement, and she urged her settlement workers to be sensitive to the cultural backgrounds of the immigrants that they worked with and to honor those immigrants. In fact, they had a playhouse that was part of the Henry Street settlement, and she insisted on plays being put on by various ethnic groups that celebrated their own culture as a way of fostering cross-cultural exchange. And here's something that she said about assimilation. She said, "If by assimilation is meant a complete physical and cultural reduction of the different ethnic groups in America to an American common denominator, then I am against it. But if it is meant as a process of exchange, of mutual advantage, then I am for it with all my heart." Interesting, she's really in the tradition here of people who supported the idea of cultural pluralism in America. And one of the biggest spokespeople for that was Rabbi Judah Magnus, who gave a very stirring sermon on that in 1909. And he talked about immigrants having, including Jews, having the right to maintain their own culture, but also Black people in America should have the right to retain their own culture as part of the American society, and that would enrich American society. And I thought we could end with this quote from Lillian Wald, which kind of ties the whole course together, I think, to some degree, and also was something that we're thinking a lot about, especially with regard to the pandemic. Remember, I had read you a quote by Lillian Wald in the first class, where she mentioned the importance in 1919, where she talked about how epidemics have no borders, right? That we really have to have an international approach to dealing with epidemics, which I think is something that we're all recognizing today as well. But here she's talking about internationalism, and she says, "We on Henry Street have become internationalists because we have found that the problems of one set of people are the problems of all, and that the vision which long since proclaimed the interdependence and the kinship of mankind was far-sighted and is true. All the varied experience of our intercourse with the many races points to the inevitable, that people rise and fall together, that no one group or nation dare be an economic or social law unto itself. That has been the lesson we have learned in the years at Henry Street." So I thought that might be a nice way to end. And I'm going to stop the share so I can see everybody. See if that worked. Not yet. Okay. So I know we covered a lot of ground today, but I'm sure that you have some questions and comments. Yes, Denise.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. I'm wondering which communal leaders, rabbis, etc., were particularly active in the 1940s when European Jewry was being decimated. I know there were people that went to Roosevelt, that went to the State Department to try to get the quotas reversed. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, well, actually, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who we talked a lot about in this course, remember we said he was very active on both fronts. He was very active on the social justice front, but also on the Jewish communal front, as many of these people were. And I would say that Stephen Wise was the foremost Jewish leader of the 1940s period. There were many others, but he was the leading figure. He struggled a lot during that period because, and there's actually a new book that just came out about Stephen Wise's role by the historian Raphael Medoff, called "The Jews Should Keep Quiet." That's the title of the book, and it's about specifically about Stephen Wise and FDR, and Wise was in a tough spot because he had some access to FDR, but he didn't have as much access as some other Jews who were part of the administration. He was an advocate for Jews, and he was an important liaison between the Jewish community and the Roosevelt administration. But he didn't have complete access, and he had to be very diplomatic, and it was difficult. So some people say that he did a great deal to try to save Jews. Some people fault him for being a little too timid. So there are different evaluations, but certainly he was in the forefront. But there were many other people too. Many people who the Joint Distribution Committee was extremely active in working on behalf of Jewish rescue, and of course there were a number of leaders of the Joint Distribution Committee as well. So there were many other people, but he's usually identified as the leading figure. Yes, Arlene?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for tonight. I have a comment, and some of you may have heard me say this before, but one of the things that I am extremely proud of my father was that he was a part of the March on Washington, and he was there in 1963 to hear Reverend King's speech. And as it affected me, about 5 years ago, one of my nephews got married down in Tennessee, in Memphis. And while we were there, we took a tour of the motel where Dr. King was actually assassinated. And I just found myself so emotional there. But I was very happy that you gave us the name of Rabbi Prinz, and I plan on looking up his speech, because I'm sure that was another speech that my father heard if it was right before Reverend King spoke. So thank you for letting me know about that, and I'll research it.
Yes, I mean, it's very easy to find. If you just Google Rabbi Prinz, you can hear him give the speech. And it was, I excerpt it, but it's really a very short speech. So it's very short and very powerful.
I have a banner and a sash that my father had on that day, and a pin that he wore. I have to find it. I know it's somewhere, but.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's wonderful. Yes, Leslie.
Yeah, I know this is going to sound a little petty. There certainly has been a difference between Black-Jewish relations in the 60s and more currently. A few years ago, when we went to the African American Museum in Washington, I specifically went looking for a reference to Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, and there was none.
Wow. Wow, that's sad. Very sad. Yes, I mean, that's something that that I was going to mention. I'm glad you brought it up, that of course, we all know that there have been a lot of tensions between the Jewish and Black communities in recent decades. A number of books have come out about it. There's a well-known book by Murray Friedman, who was the longtime head of the American Jewish Committee here in Philadelphia and wrote many books on American Jewish history and Philadelphia Jewish history in particular. And he has a book called What Went Wrong about the Black-Jewish Alliance. But there have been a number of books about it. You know, it's sad because there's this long, proud history of collaboration. And as a number of historians have pointed out, there continued to be a lot of cooperation in the Black Jewish community, and continues even today in a variety of ways. So it's not like there was a complete rift, but there certainly were tensions over many issues, and a number of anti-Semitic spokesmen in the Black community, and that's been difficult. But still, there continue to be a lot of cooperative efforts and a lot of commonality. But I'm glad you raised that. Thank you. Yes, Michael?
Yeah, a lot of this break came with the identification of African Americans as African Americans, not Negroes. And they didn't want any relationship or debt to anybody else. And I think it culminated in the movie of Selma, where they deliberately wrote out any participation by Joshua Heschel. The other thing is that I know you mentioned the name of Jacob Rothschild at least twice today. He was my rabbi who confirmed me, and I became a mentor in my early 20s, and we conferred often in my 30s. So you didn't show a picture of him, so I decided to
Oh,
put it here.
wonderful.
There. So if you can see, if that shows up.
Oh, wonderful. That's a great one. Terrific.
So there he is.
Thank you.
So I just felt I had an obligation to at least let you see his face.
Thank you very much. Yes, I didn't put the picture in, but I think it's very moving that John Ossoff used his Chumash.
Oh, yeah.
That's really something. And it's very, I think, as we said, very, did you know his wife too?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah. So she wrote this article in the foreword just after the swearing in, and said how moving that was for her.
Yeah, she also wrote the book on the 100th anniversary of the congregation.
Wow.
So that As a Day, I think is the title, by Jenith Rothschild.
Wow, great. I think she does some work on Southern Jewish history too. She's
Yes, she does.
yeah. Wow, terrific. Thank you. That's wonderful. Yes, Arlene?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we shouldn't give up hope, because there's still very active groups going on with racial relations. And my daughter is a volunteer as the chair of the Racial Justice Committee, which is part of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Philadelphia. And they're doing great things, and they're planning great things. So I know in this day and age, we're all thinking that, the relations have been tried, and that, there's tension, but there's great people out there working on getting things done.
Yes, thank you for that. I think so too. I think there are a lot of promising developments, and I think it's very important to remember this very proud history that we have. It's as we said, of course, not all Jews supported, these movements, but many Jews did, and there was a very strong collaboration for a long time, and continues to be today in many ways. So I think remembering the history. And it's too bad that as Leslie pointed out, that sometimes the history is not highlighted where it should be. But it's very important to for us to remember the history, because it's I think an important part of American history, an important part of American Jewish history, and it's something that should be highlighted. We have a little bit of a family involvement too. My father-in-law, Rabbi Seymour Friedman, and some of you who've been in classes with me may have heard this before, I don't know, but my father-in-law was one of a group of 19 conservative rabbis who went down to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. They had been at a rabbinical assembly convention, and the convention was talking about what was going on in the South, and they decided that there have been a number of articles written about it, and they decided that they had to go down and do something. So they didn't go for a march, but they went down to Birmingham, met with Reverend Martin Luther King, and went to the various churches, the Black churches, and tried to encourage the people. At the time, King was when they were there, King was actually in prison for a while. And so they wanted to encourage the people at that time. And then he came out, and then they actually met with him. But this was in May of 1963. So here's you can see, a little hard to show these pictures, but here's my father-in-law, Rabbi Friedman, and here's Martin Luther King, and this is Ralph Abernathy, I believe. So that was, that's our own family story. And when you talk about, kind of how it goes through the generations, when my daughter was on Operation Understanding, which is a very nice program that brings Jewish and Black students together. They used to do it, they did it for high school students, and they did it for college students. She went as a college student, and they go down to the South and they visit all of these civil rights sites. So she did that, and they went to one of the museums in Birmingham, and there was an oral history that she was listening to that said, well, we were feeling very despairing, and then these rabbis showed up and they started to teach us Hebrew songs. My father-in-law's role was to teach Hine Matovu Manayim to the people in the church, and she said, and they just raised our spirits when they came. So then my daughter told the kids in her group about that this was her grandfather, and so they managed to have a conference call with my father-in-law, and he spoke to the whole group when they were actually in Birmingham. So it's very interesting, kind of cross-generational story. But yes, many of us have a connection one way or the other. Any other thoughts or comments?
Well, thank you so much, Rena. These 4 sessions were amazing. We learned a lot.
Enjoyable evening.
Yes.
Thank you. My pleasure. It's been really nice seeing you all. And hope to see you again at Ho'ev at some point.
Yes.
In
That'd be
person.
nice, yes.
Thank you. It was
Thank you
wonderful.
very much.
All right.
Josh?
This was a wonderful series. Thank you so
Yes.
much for bringing it
Thank
all
you again.
together for
Thank
us.
you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Stay safe.
Bye. Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you, Sarah.